All right, thanks, Luke. Hi, everybody. We're just about to get started. We're going to give a few more minutes for everybody to join. I keep seeing attendees pop up, but let's give everybody a few minutes to join and we'll get kicked off. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rich Spilby. I'm a partner at Holland & Hart in Colorado, practicing out of the Boulder and Denver offices. Welcome you to the 2021 Healthcare Compliance webinar. Today we're going to be talking about some issues relating to cybersecurity and privacy. I'm going to chat for a few minutes to kick us off while more people join. I know we've got a number of people planning to attend and want to give them a few minutes to find us. If you look at your webinar screen, there's an opportunity to submit questions via chat functionality. Where I can, I'm going to try to get to those as we go. If I'm not able to get them as we go, I'm going to leave some time at the end of the hour so that we can address those. And worst case, because they kind of pop up on a sidebar on my screen and I can't always see them when I'm chatting away, worst case, if I don't see it in real time, I'll make sure to reach back out to you and we can have a conversation about your question. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about me. So I mentioned I'm a partner in Colorado. The primary focus of my practice is technology, transactions, and cybersecurity. And where that overlaps with healthcare is I handle a lot of information technology, intellectual property, and related transactions, including things like electronic health record solutions and deployments, as well as cybersecurity issues, responding to data breaches, etc. We have, and you know from participating in past webinars, a pretty robust healthcare group throughout our firm, and I work with them on a regular basis on where we intersect. Today I won't be talking as much about pure healthcare as I will be talking about cybersecurity issues as they relate to healthcare. So with that as an introduction, let's get started. So when I talk about privacy and data security, I like to talk about it from a framework of a life cycle. And the life cycle starts typically at the data entry point, the data collection point. It involves, where it comes from, what data is collected, et cetera. It involves, looking at all the different ways the data might be collected, used, stored, and protected. Continues to use and marketing in terms of, what are all the use cases for data, how long you use it for, where does it go when you're done, from a destruction or removal or return standpoint, data breach prevention and readiness, which includes planning for bad things to happen and making sure you have a plan to address it, and then dealing, unfortunately, with what happens sometimes is litigation about uses of data, data breaches, et cetera. For a number of you who may have unfortunately experienced things like a data breach or an issue, you may enter into this life cycle at different places. I've certainly had clients, particularly in healthcare, where my first intersection with them is due to an incident. And sometimes it's, we meet for the first time when you're implementing some new software, SaaS, IT solution, maybe an IoT solution, maybe smart beds, those types of issues, and learning how to deal with the intersection of technology, privacy, and healthcare is the types of work we do and how we deal with them. So today's agenda, I want to talk a little bit about the threats we face in cybersecurity and specific to healthcare. I want to talk a little bit about the guidance that's out there and some of the things that I view as moving targets from a compliance standpoint. And I also want to spend some time talking about the scary things of when bad things happen, which unfortunately happen sometimes, and I think it's fair to say that very often we have to assume that at some point we are going to be hit by some bad thing. Hopefully it's a small one, but it's important to know to be ready for it. So I like to start off with some kind of data points. There's a number of studies that come out each year that talk about data breaches. There's one put out by the Ponyman Institute that's underwritten by IBM, and they talk about this. I pulled these statistics from the Verizon data breach study that comes out each summer. The Verizon study goes and looks at the proliferation of data breaches based upon reported data breaches. They divide their analysis into incidents versus breaches, and then they actually dice it up and look at it amongst different industries, different silos, et cetera. I pulled some general statistics here and also some things that were specific to healthcare. So there's some interesting information here about how many of the breaches involved hacking, how many of the breaches involve misconfiguration of cloud platforms, et cetera. What's most interesting has been a proliferation and increase in ransomware, which is becoming more and more of a problem, and you've probably heard about it and seen it. One of the places you've seen it was last fall, I believe in October. The FBI came out with an actual public warning, which it doesn't do very often, describing the fact that the healthcare industry has been under attack from a cybersecurity standpoint. So we've learned we're definitely on the crosshairs, and one of the riskiest places that we encounter this is in ransomware. We used to be and still are very, very concerned about protected health information getting out in the world because that's got its own danger. But I think what's even more scary is issues about ransomware, where instead of the information being taken away, systems are locked up. There's been way too much of that lately. One of the other issues that comes up in the study is that there's been a reduction as we move through time of something that's been more typical for healthcare. Healthcare's been the only vector that historically the last few years has had more misuse or loss of data coming from internal actors than external actors. Very often that's been things like misassigned or misused credentials that are merely mistakes. They haven't all been bad guys. That gap is narrowing, and it's not clear yet whether that gap is narrowing because internal issues have been declining, or is it because the number of incidents has been going up and more of those incidents have been external actors. That gap has narrowed, and I'm talking about this in the second bullet here. In the 2019 study, almost 60% of all cybersecurity incidents involved internal people, both mistakes and intentional acts, compared to 42% involving bad guys hacking in from the outside. That's narrowed significantly to where it's almost 50-50. Another thing that's interesting is that the number of incidents in the most recent study rose to over 500. And this is publicly reported breaches and incidents. It's certainly not all, because not all incidents are publicly reported. In the 2019 study, there were only 304. And privilege misuse, which, as I mentioned, of all of the internal threats, has dropped to about 8%. Again, it's not clear whether that's just dropping because the number of incidents has almost doubled, so as a proportion of the total list, maybe privilege misuse cases have remained the same. But I do think that we're getting smarter, because privilege misuse, there have been some cases talking about this, and it's involved basic mistakes. There was a big case in Europe involving a GDPR violation where the real issue was just the hospital assigned the same access credential to everybody. And even though they had a framework that said a physician needs access to certain sets of information and other administrators and personnel needed access to smaller sets of information, when those credentials were assigned, pretty much everybody in the organization was given that same physician credential, so everybody had access to all information. That's a privilege problem. That's a misassigned privilege. It's a mistake, but I think we're getting better on making sure we're limiting access to the only people that need access. Anyway, lots of interesting points from the study, and I encourage you to check out these different studies to gather more information about what the risks are. So I want to talk about real risk for a second, and I'm going to do that through maybe a not so quite real scenario, but it's one that happens every day. I just pulled this information in this morning. I have teenage daughters, and as it turns out, they're very invested in a TV show called Grey's Anatomy, which you might all be familiar with. I've learned one important thing from Grey's Anatomy, is that I never want to go to this hospital in Seattle, because so many of the people there are much more involved in their own social lives than they are in their work. But I did learn last night, my daughters showed me, because they know the area in which I work, they said, there's a ransomware episode. And I said, this might be interesting since we're talking about healthcare today. So I wanted to take a moment and present this scenario, because even though it's a fictional television show, there's a whole lot we can learn from what happened and how they responded, because there's actually hospitals that are dealing with this every day, including right now. So let me talk about it for a second. This scenario started where there's a doctor in the ER, and the first thing he notices is a patient's heart monitor flatlines. Now, unfortunately, that's not unusual. This happens sometimes to a patient. So they immediately scramble, they call for a crash cart, they pull out the paddles, and right before they're about to shock the patient to bring their heart back into rhythm, all of the other monitors in the entire ER start to hiccup, and they all start to flatline. And thankfully, our hero in the scene, Dr. Owen Hunt, pauses, realizes what's going on, and realizes that maybe these people aren't actually crashing and that there's a problem in the system. That's the first sign of something going wrong. It continues to proliferate throughout the hospital. While we've got hiccups going in the ER, Dr. Meredith Gray's working on an operation on a woman with an enlarged spleen. She's going in, arthroscopically or remotely, relying on a lot of technology, electronic cameras, et cetera, to guide her as she removes this spleen. And as she starts, the monitors in OR start to flicker, start to go on and off, and she realizes she's got a problem in the middle of surgery. And in another part of the hospital, Dr. Miranda Bailey sits down at a computer workstation to access the health record system. She goes to type in her username, she goes to type in her login information, and it says access denied. So it's going system by system, things are shutting down. It ultimately comes to pass that not only has this virus or this piece of ransomware got into the electronic health record system, it's even gotten into the building management system, the BMS. So they can't type a code into a secured area to get to blood banks. They can't type a code in to get to prescription medication out of a locked facility. It's a problem. And up on a computer screen pops the ransomware notice. It says, we control your hospital, we own your servers, we have your medical records. They've got it all. I've worked with a number of clients who've gotten this language, it's gotten this notice, and it shuts everything down. The bad guys come in, they essentially encrypt your system so that they can get to it and you can't. And the question is, what do you do? Now, we learned from Grey's Anatomy, there's probably some things we can look at and say, here's what you can do. Here's good things they did. But frankly, if you watch this episode, I look at it and I say, this is an episode of what happens when you're not prepared. Because even though they did what they could, they called Tim the IT guy. And Tim the IT guy's first answer was, let's turn the computer on and off, which is often something suggested by everybody's version of Tim the IT guy. There was a debate that went on over, should we just pay the ransom, with one doctor saying, well, it's only 4,932 Bitcoin. That can't be much. How about I write a check right now? But the reality is, based upon the conversion rate of Bitcoin to dollars, this was a $20 million ransom. Now, this episode took place a couple years ago. The Bitcoin values fluctuate, but it's absolutely true that where just a few years ago, you might have ransom requests in the neighborhood of $10,000. They've now gone into the millions, partially because they've been paid and they've realized these quick hitter attacks can be more profitable, and that sometimes when you really need to get to a system, there's people who will pay. But I think one of the most important things that we can learn from this episode is that there wasn't a plan. You see the reaction to it, and again, this is TV. You see people scrambling. You see the FBI charging in. But what you don't see is a concerted response plan for how to deal with the issue. So I want to turn to what the guidance is on this, not just ransomware, but on cybersecurity, and also talk about the things we can do to put plans in place to better protect ourselves. So I want to talk about the guidance for a second. You probably already know that one of our best sources of guidance in healthcare is from the Department of Health and Human Services, and they've got this great website that has some linkages to some good stuff, including ransomware, including a cybersecurity checklist, and including things like the NIST Cybersecurity framework, which gives you a lot of rules that you can follow to help harden yourself against risks. This includes things like specific documentation on cybersecurity practices intended to manage threats, protect patients, and harden your systems. Among the guidance, the goal is stated as there has to be a culture change about the importance and necessity of cybersecurity. Now, this is something that isn't unique to healthcare. It's something that is necessary kind of across the universe of everywhere we have information needs to be protected. You know, once upon a time, whenever an entity, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a storefront, whether it's a law firm, a lot of businesses would view risk solely based upon, hey, look, I'm signing a contract with a SaaS vendor or a records vendor or an IT vendor, and what does it cost? And if it costs me $50,000 a year for that product or service, my risk is $50,000. And if it costs me $100,000, then it's $100,000. But the reality is when we're talking about data protection and data security and the risks of ransomware, the true risk is actually what happens when bad things happen, what happens to that information. It's not the dollar value. And I think that's something that we have to think about when we consider what risk does this relationship expose us to. That's more of the change that we need to think about. And when we think about that change, we need to view even the $1,000 contract as something that if it involves access to data, something that could have a $20 million risk associated with it. So what are some of the most prevalent attacks these days? We talk about these in cybersecurity as attack vectors, right? Which is a very military-sounding term, but it's not all that, not off-center. It's what direction are they coming from and where are they going? Email phishing, ransomware, lost laptops or equipment walking out the door, insider, accidental, or intentional data loss. And one of the biggest concerns I've had is these days we have these Internet of Things devices. That was the buzzword for several years. We've got these sophisticated devices, things like medical beds, diagnostic tools, and in this current day and age, remote diagnostic tools that give us these instantaneous reads on somebody's condition or their heart rate or something else, and they do it through connecting to a network. And any one of those devices could give us a lot of information, and at the same time, any one of those devices has a risk of being attacked. We talk about, I use the example of Grey's Anatomy about being locked out of buildings. We've seen this happen, not just in hospitals. We've seen it happen where there have been hacks against buildings where they locked all the doors that wouldn't let anybody in and turned the heat on. We've seen a number of restaurant companies who may centrally control their air conditioning or their cooling units, and seen those hacked where they turn the temperature up or down to cause harm. I've seen retail POS systems hacked, taken by ransomware, and shut down before a big holiday sales weekend. All of those kind of things are risks that we face. Now, some of these risks overlap, right? Very often, ransomware comes in somewhere through an email phishing attack or some sort of social engineering where they connect with somebody via email, convince them it's important to click on a link, and they do so, and in comes the ransomware or the malware. We do still see, and I think we're better at responding to, things like lost laptops, misplaced tablets, those types of hacks. It's not all that long ago where we've had records, military records, healthcare records, etc., dumped in bins that are supposed to be shredded and they don't get shredded, dumped in boxes outside an office when it moves, etc. So there's a lot of current threats to get our arms around, and our job is to find a way to mitigate the risk and close down the vectors. So let's talk in a little more detail from them. So the first one I mentioned is an email phishing attack. And this is where somebody gets an email, looks like it's from an IT support person, maybe it's from your boss, maybe it's from your own IT security department. And that email says, hey, I just need you to click on this link to update information, to access some information, etc. And that click is what actually either allows a person to offer up, invites them to offer up their credentials so their credentials are stolen, or by clicking on that link, it automatically downloads malicious code. One of the reasons we have this risk is that these days we get so many emails a day. Now, I don't remember where I pulled the statistic about an average person getting 80 emails per day. I would say these days that's a pretty light day for most of us. And weeding through what's real and what's not from the spam and also doing it at a time when you're busy and have to be in a lot of places requires some intentionality. So some of the questions that it's important to educate ourselves on and educate our crews on and our coworkers on is making sure we're being real careful about what we respond to and click on. Do we know the sender? Is there anything that's just a little off? Now, hackers are getting better at this, but it still is, if you look at where the emails come from, it might say it's from your boss, it might say it's from somebody else, but looking at where the email actually came from is important to validate. If you're ever suspicious, hover over a link to see what the URL underneath it really says. If there's anything that looks funny, always report it. Very often, I run into this every day, and sometimes you even have your own IT department that's trying to do something good, that's trying to say, here's a good policy. Here's a survey we're trying to do to check your usage of your tablet or your smartphone, and they ask you to click on it. And I've gotten to the point where these days I actually pick up the phone and call IT and say, hey, you know what, I want to make sure you just sent me something that I'm supposed to click on. I want to make sure I'm really supposed to click on it. And that's one of the safeguards that we should have in place and put in place with all of our people to protect ourselves. So how do we implement policies, and what are the rules we can do to make sure that we protect ourselves from this threat? Always be suspicious, especially if something's asking for information, even if it's basic information. Implement training to recognize these suspicious emails and to make sure everybody knows where to send them or where to report them. Never open an email attachment unless you know where it's coming from and what it's for. A lot of systems do this these days, but I think it's really helpful to have functionality in your email system that identifies external emails. It flags them so that you know you're coming from the outside. Implement an incident response plan so that you manage the attacks and know how to shut them off. Implement technologies for detecting and testing emails. Multi-factor authentication is one of those front-end security measures that helps to make sure that it's not just a username and password that gets you in. So even if a phishing attack is successful, there's actually one more step somebody has to take to get into the system. Implement response procedures so that when an employee clicks on an email, make sure it still gets reported. There can sometimes be a shame component to it where somebody clicks on something, says oops, and then is afraid to report it. And it's important to have a reporting mechanism that allows them to report it, encourages them to report it in a way that you can get ahead of it. If it's too punitive, you're going to scare people away from reporting. And establish cyber threat information sharing with other healthcare organizations. There are organizations that do this, and even some that we help facilitate within our footprint, where we have CISOs from various organizations get together once a month and share this kind of information. And sometimes your peers, even when they're at another hospital, are some of your best sources of information for the types of risks you're facing and the types of risks they're dealing with. All right, ransomware. Now, we just talked about ransomware at Gray Sloan Memorial Hospital. Ransomware very often comes through that same kind of threat vector through an email. Maybe it's something that came from your boss. Maybe it's from a credit card company. Something that says we need to download a security update. Maybe it looks like it's from your IT department that says we need to upload a new Windows patch. But in any event, there's an entry point for a program to come in. It finds and encrypts the data, and you can't get to it without paying the ransom. The impact, as we saw at Gray Sloan, is you can't even see a patient chart. Now, there's a couple ways to set up against this. Knowing how to identify bad emails or suspicious emails is important. Having firewalls and technical protections in place is helpful. I think it's important to note, when I went through that study from the Verizon breach study, they pointed out something that's pretty important about ransomware, and that is, in healthcare, under HIPAA, ransomware is considered a data breach. It's and a significant one that's reportable. Under most state data breach notification laws, it's not there yet. And the reason why it's not there yet is it's treated as an incident. And there's a technical distinction between an incident and a breach. And an incident can be as minor as, you had somebody poke the system and try to get in that didn't have access. Or somebody forgets their ID card and can't scan in the morning. All those things can be incidents, and they happen every day, and they're not a big deal. But a ransomware incident is not always treated as a breach for notification purposes because the information doesn't always leave. There's a lot of state breach notification laws that are based upon the idea that the information is stolen. But in a ransomware incident, it often isn't. It never leaves your system. It's just you're locked out. One of the key ways to protect against ransomware, and this is from an IT perspective, is to make sure you've got a quality separate backup system that is talking about or that addresses and backs up your data consistently. If the ransomware attacks your primary operating system, you're shut down. But if you can disconnect and reconnect to a backup and access that data, you can be back in business quickly. You've got to be set up for that, and it's got to be an environment that's segregated, because if it's not segregated and not protected, the ransomware can infect that backup system too. Another way to do it is through user awareness training, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. We're not always going to be able to recognize the bad email, but the better programs I've seen in place consist of a couple components. It's regular training, and it also consists of sometimes testing. And testing to say, okay, we've trained you. We've trained you to look at things to recognize it. Sometimes there's a quiz. And then every now and then, we might test people's adoption of that training. Not to be punitive, but to sort of make sure the training is taking hold. I'll give you an example, and this is something that I've seen. I know we do a version of it at our firm where we have a training module, and then we say every person has to go through this training module, and it's usually a pretty short training session. You can complete it online. Of course, you have to click on something to get to it, but you go through, and it's educational. It talks about, hey, look, here's what an email looks like if it's fake. Here's the things to look for. Here's how you might hover over a URL to see whether it might be real or not, and things to look for. And here's what you do with the email. And once we've done that education, very often there's a quiz at the end of it, and you have to go through and answer a certain number of questions correctly to move forward. And what we do is we give you a handy certificate. Now, I put mine on my wall, and I'm not sure if that many other people do, but I like to make sure that I at least pass, since I'm the one advising people on this. And then a couple times a year, we actually do follow up and track with emails, where we send out an email. The IT department does it. We send out an email. We include something that actually should trigger suspicion, and we track who clicks on it or who doesn't. Now, that part of it is something that your own organization can set up, and there are actually security vendors out there who can help you put this kind of program in place. I think the big trick to this program is making sure that how you handle somebody who clicks on the bad link is addressed in a form of training. It can't be punitive. It can't be scary, because that induces somebody to kind of hide what they're doing. But it is important to look at that and look at the statistics and say, okay, if 3% of our people actually clicked on that malicious email, what do we need to do? Maybe we need to do more periodic training. Maybe we retrain those other people, but you can build your program from there. And there are resources out there in the form of information security experts that offer these types of programs if you don't have the ability to set one up already. And we can, and as you go along, you know, as part of your overall program, you typically identify what are the risks to our organization each year, and put together a scorecard. And some of your risks might be external risks. Some of them might be this email risk. But your hope is that over time, through continually training, that training has to go to new hires, and it should go to everybody periodically. And hopefully you narrow that gap. And over time, you can track how many times are we having people clicking on these things, and are we getting better? So I've made a link here to kind of some of the specific guidelines and standards about how do we protect ourselves from ransomware. You know, we already talked a lot about user training. Some of it has to do with background IT stuff in terms of making sure we limit access to different systems to only the people who need access to systems, putting in a strong password policy with multi-factor authentication, which means there's some other identifier. If you look along, you know, if you took the opportunity after this call to Google what does a password need to be, you're going to see different rules on that. But one of the most interesting ones is there's people who've run algorithms who said, hey, look, if I take a fancy computer and I have it run every combination it can get to hack a password that's 12 characters long versus 8 characters long, it's interesting to see how hard a computer has to work to get there. And it also is interesting to see what's the difference that different variables have in play. The more complex you can make your password in terms of requirements of different characters, randomness, number of characters, the safer you can be and the harder it is to hack. Limitations on how and when people can log in from remote locations is another element. Segregation of different types of systems from other systems is especially helpful for ransomware. In a healthcare system, it gets a little harder because we've got a lot of overlapping needs to access data. But very often you can architect a system where you can say, we need one system to be hardened in a certain way and protected from others, mainly to prevent the ransomware from taking over the whole thing. So separation of the BMS system, for example, from the EHR system is helpful in that regard. And perhaps the biggest weaknesses here that's covered in probably about the bottom half of these tips on this slide is all about having incident response procedures in place, a playbook, knowing who to call, knowing who needs to come in and knowing who needs to be in the response. That's all an important part of all of our responses. All right, loss of data. I'm going to spend a little less time on this one because we can do things to protect ourselves, but this all comes down to, you know, user conduct that we need to train people to do, etc. And there's some relatively easy steps to deal with here. The scenario here is a physician or some sort of care provider leaves a laptop or a tablet down for just a moment. Somebody walks away with it. Unfortunately, with all the people coming in and out of a hospital, this can happen a lot. It's also happened where people are traveling and leave a laptop at security at the airport. They leave a laptop in a cab. It can happen all the time. A couple different ways to do this. Encryption on all the devices is helpful. That's one of the big things we can do to protect ourselves. There are organizations that have particularly sensitive information that might separate out your day-to-day laptop with a travel laptop that is more hardened in case you're going someplace, so that if it's lost, it doesn't have a repository of data on it. And maybe it doesn't even allow for local storage. There's another user training issue here, making sure that the moment somebody discovers something's lost, they know who to call. And that the information about how to get a hold of those people is immediately available. That way that they can be walked through how to respond, access can be shut off to that device, etc. So the quicker we get information about what happened, the faster we can do something about it. What are the things we can do before it happens? Well, encryption, I already talked about that. Having an appropriate data backup solution that's proven and tested and segregated, including a safeguard policy for mobile devices that includes user training on how to use them, prompt reporting of devices, maintaining an accurate inventory. This one can be a little harder, but it's always important to know, whether people are using their own devices and whether that's even permitted versus having something that's prepared and implemented and secured by the IT staff that's checked out that we can control a little better. We can control our own devices, our own facilities devices, a whole lot better than we can everybody else's individual devices. And then on the back end, making sure we have an ability to remove or delete information from all kinds of devices before anything happens to it. This can be tricky sometimes. So especially if it's, a bring your own device situation, there are companies out there that now assist banks and healthcare providers with deletion of data. I've assisted before in the preparation of some of these contracts. It can be a little bit of a pitfall because if it's your device or your facility or your information, no matter what your relationship is with that provider, it is your responsibility. You might ask them to take responsibility for it, but even if they were agree to do so, if there's ever a problem, the regulators, the patients, everybody's looking to you because it's really your job to make sure it gets done. And I think that's important to remember. All right. Another threat, accidental loss, insider loss, or even an insider who tries to steal data for whatever reason. Sometimes this happens when you've got somebody who's a staff member or a friend of a staff member trying to get information for some malicious purpose. Similar to kind of the phishing thing, if anything isn't right, it's important to report it. This is an area where we see a lot of confidence crimes, just like the phishing, where somebody sounds legit. We very often have to call people up to share information, but it's important to make sure we know who people are. An easy way to do this sometimes is you get that phone call, take their number down, find out who they are, call them back. Make sure that they actually are at the office they say they're from. Regular security awareness training to talk about the risks of this attack is helpful too, and it's part of that comprehensive program. And I think it's also helpful in a plug for the IT security professionals in all of these cases. If you're doing an ongoing or regular security assessment, part of that assessment includes not only evaluating you, but having them update you on what are the types of risks that are emerging each year. That's always helpful to know. So how do we work against this and protect ourselves against this threat? Again, train our staff and IT users on all of our procedures to protect ourselves against social engineering or just process errors. Make sure we pay real close attention to who has access to certain health record systems and sensitive data. Use privilege access management tools. Make sure we understand what each person's role is and what they need to know. Obviously, your providers who are actually providing healthcare need the most access to it, but not everybody does. And we can create different layers of privilege access to make sure that people are not getting access of information they don't need to use their job, to do their job. And also making sure we have tools to prevent leakage of information via email, via web uploads, via configurations, etc. All right. Now to the scary one, medical devices. We talked about this with the ransomware incident at Gray Sloan. Heart monitors, access restrictions to blood bank and prescription medication. The type of attack that takes over not your record system, but your facility. These have their own risks and concerns. And this all comes back to the plan. Having a plan to talk about and maybe a tabletop exercise to look at, what do we do if this happens? This is something I've seen hospitals are pretty good at, because we have a plan to respond to triages. We have a plan to respond to situations where you get flooded because of a major event, big car accident, bus accident. There's a process to go through to be able to manage that kind of issue. This is the same thing. It's like being able to deal with power outages and having a backup plan. It's like dealing with any other threat to the physical hospital, and how do we deal with it? Having a plan that says, what do we do if our electronic health record system is down, or we can't get into a part of the hospital, is important. And now that everything's interconnected, this is where it's important to say, to have that plan consider, how should we architect our system, or how can we build our system to where we can silo off or protect the systems from each other, hopefully so that not everything goes down at once, as it did on our favorite TV show. It's important to know and be in touch with, when we're talking about medical devices, that we're patching them, that we're continuing to support them, that we have security controls on everything that's networked, making sure we're tracking all those access points. Now, this is where we get into some things that I do on a daily basis. Whenever we're looking to buy something that's going to be networked, accessing information, etc., before you even start talking about the deal, it's important to look at the security, and it's essentially part of the procurement process, making sure we understand what the security requirements are in place. We're just starting to see some individual legal requirements, such as in California, that say, hey, if you've got an IoT-type device, anything that's going to be networked or controlled or accessible by an app or a phone, whether it be your home security system or a hospital bed, got to have reasonable security measures in place. And conducting an evaluation of what that device does and what the risk is of some bad guy hacking into it and stealing information or being able to take over control of it is an important part of even the purchasing decision. Making sure we conduct a risk assessment of that every year is critical. So we can't just do it on the front end. There has to kind of be an ongoing requirement to review the security on that every year, to look at the access controls to it, because everybody you give access to that is another potential risk factor. And then implementing practices to make sure that we're constantly monitoring that for attempts, for risks that are constantly changing. So in order to do all of this, we just talked about a lot of real specific detail on some real specific risks. I want to back away for a moment and talk about some of the rules that we're subject to. Now, we don't have something that says, here's exactly what you need and what you need to do when you buy a networked hospital bed. What we've got is some basic rules that leave open to us the how we do it. But the starting point is in the HIPAA security rule, which says we need to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all electronic protected health information that we create, receive, maintain, or transmit. We need to protect against reasonably anticipated threats or hazards. We need to protect about reasonably anticipated unauthorized uses or disclosures, and we need to make sure our workforce remains in compliance with it. So, what are the security measures? Well, that's where it gets a little tricky because it doesn't tell us. It's a sliding scale. It all depends on the size, complexity of the capabilities, the risks you're facing, what your infrastructure is, and your security capabilities, and what the potential risks are to protected health information. What the precise measures are where we need to look at what's available and what we really need to do when we look at our entire organization. This isn't something you can do on a one-time basis. It has to be done regularly, at a minimum of annually, and some businesses do it as often as quarterly, looking at all the different things you need to test and review, constantly looking at your policies, procedures, procurement activities, and the risks you're facing, and looking at ways you need to change them in relation to new and emerging risks. As part of the safeguards you put in place, generally the terminology we use and the statutes use talks about putting physical safeguards, administrative safeguards, technical safeguards in place. And as part of the administrative safeguards, that includes conducting risk analysis. Risk analysis is bringing those folks in to say, hey, look, what's our current state? What are the risks we're facing? And what do we need to do to help mitigate those risks? That's an important part of your regular assessment that we need to be doing at a minimum every year. The physical safeguards include everything from your facility access controls, the locks on the doors, how people use workstations, how people work remotely, what we do for data backup and storage, and what we do with records and from the creation to the maintenance to the disposal. Technical safeguards can also include things like access controls through your IT systems, things like passwords, which we talked about before, multi-factor authentication, limiting access on a privilege basis, requiring automated log-offs, and emergency access procedures. So the HHS has, among the resources on there, they even have their own security risk assessment tool. They've got a few different versions of that. If you don't have something to start with, that's a starting point. One of the tools they actually point you to is also the NIST Standard, which is an overall methodology for security management programs. They've got their own description of what a risk assessment process might look like. And it always has some flavor of identifying your threat sources, identifying your risks, identifying your vulnerabilities, and then determining probabilities and what to do about it. And it's a good high-level starting point, and there are certainly experts that we could point you to help run you through that. All of those things are available on the HHS website as a starting point. So I wanted to offer up one more way of thinking about this, especially when we're talking about a risk assessment. We think a lot when we're looking to buy something, and we already talked about it as a procurement process or as a diligence process. And I think a lot of times we focus on investigating the vendor the service provider, the supplier. But I like to flip it around and think about it first. Let's start with us. And if we know ourselves and how we operate, we can do a better job of assessing what they're doing. It all starts with what data we have. Where do we have it? Where does it originate? Where does it get stored? Who do we share it with? Who are all the people that can touch it and see it electronically, physically? How do they access it? What is their need to access it and for how long? What are our current rules around it? And what legal rules do we need to follow between things like HIPAA, between insurance requirements and legal standards, and state law regarding personal information? And what security methodology and standards do you follow? I mentioned NIST a lot. It's not the only one, but it is one of the overarching ones in the United States. There's certainly other ones you can implement and follow, and they give you kind of guidelines and rules to follow for how to implement a program. In order to evaluate that starting point, you got to have all the right people involved. And this includes all the people who are using the data and what their needs are, the executive team and leadership, the people who are living and breathing and working in the system every day and what their uses of the system are, your security folks, your HR folks, operations folks, all those people need to be involved in their own way so that we can understand what their data usage is and where our risk lies. If we're only looking at one use case or one department or how one group of people is using it, we're missing a big part of the picture, which might mean we're missing a big risk. I made a brief mention of this earlier when I was talking about the fact that you could have a $1,000 contract create a $20 million liability. Whenever we're looking at evaluating what our risk might be, the amount of effort we put into diligence should be based upon the risk. And the bigger risk we have, whether we're talking about a risk of data breach or ransomware, as compared to dealing with hacking of IoT beds, has to be related to the risks it's exposed you to. And these days with data protection, when we're dealing about health information, that means the diligence effort should be pretty robust and should look at what's the harm to patients, not just from a PR perspective, but if a system gets taken down, when we're in the middle of hospital operations, when we're in the middle of a surgery, what are all the bad things that can happen? How can we mitigate against that? And the bigger that risk is, the more we need to do on the front end to make sure we're putting measures in place to protect it. So I've got some slides here that I might leave for you guys to think about a little bit. It gets a little bit into the contract negotiations, and I think I wanted to focus a little more on technical security. But it is important to note that if you are buying something, EHR system, hospital beds, et cetera, it's important to consider, once we've done all of our risk analysis, making sure we put our requirements on paper. And when we're talking about data protection, it means not just conducting that diligence on the front end, but also make sure you have an ongoing ability throughout that relationship to follow up, make sure that that service provider or vendor is following the rules, make sure they're deleting data, make sure they're updating their requirements to comply with law, make sure they're still in compliance, and maybe even conducting their own audits. Got a note here on some different audits and certifications. An electronic health records provider, for instance, I want to know what security methodology they follow and how do they verify it each year. Do they do audits? Do they do certifications? Reviewing the audit and make sure it's robust and covers what it needs to cover. We already talked a little bit about the threats of data breaches. We talked about how they can shut down a hospital and cause a lot of risk of harm to patients. Typically, we think about three different types of things they cause. They cause business disruption, operational disruption. It can cause reputational harm, and on the back end can lead to litigation, which has its own dollar risk associated with it. There's more specific guidance on this, including a quick response checklist on the HHS website, talking about, hey, what do we do if we just experience a cyber attack? Part of having a better response than Gray Sloan did is actually having this plan written down, making sure you've got all the people involved who can help out with it, from cybersecurity experts who are ready to go, your legal team, your executive team, and your response team that can kind of get things back online. In the Grey's Anatomy example, a team of FBI guys showed up, which is fine if you need a team of FBI guys. They may not always be the first call. So we've got a reporting obligation, and reporting criminal activity is important, but we've also got, the assessments that need to happen. We also have to make sure that we've got experts coming in to help reduce and mitigate against the actual threat. I'm going to skip over these because we're running low on time. This is sort of a anatomy of an incident. Talks a little bit about how we go from thousands of little incidents that your security department deals with every day that don't turn into anything, and how they ultimately filter down to the biggies. Very often we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of little things every day. Very few become major incidents that are reportable, but we're always tracking and looking for those risks and trying to make sure we mitigate against them. Big part of preparing an incident response plan is to understand what the life cycle looks like and making sure that on the front end, we've got our contacts, we know what we want to do from a notification standpoint, we know how we get the right people together, and we conduct things like tabletop exercises to understand how we are going to move through it and practice it. That might include an internal investigation team. One of the risks we have sometimes is making sure that we, on the early stages of a data breach incident, we want to protect ourselves from it, but we also want to make sure we've got a team that can protect the information, even about what's happening, until we really have our heads around it. And that might include keeping the team relatively small so that misinformation doesn't get out. And so if there is a risk that's going to turn into a legal risk, we're protecting the information we find by attorney-client privilege. And we can get there, you get there by having your legal team be a part of your response. They assist in the investigation, they assist in the remediation, and in doing so, there's some liability protection on the back end where we can be able to say, hey, look, if an attorney's conducting the investigation and spearheading it, we can protect a lot of our internal conversations and discussions from discovery later on by attorney-client privilege. I'm going to stop for a moment since we've hit our hour, and we've covered a lot of ground, covered it very quickly. There's a lot more detail in the PowerPoint which I can make available, but I wanted to see if there were any other questions since we've been covering so much ground. And feel free to chime in on the chat functionality if there are. I'm going to continue moving through a few more things for a few more minutes, but if you do have questions, just grab me and I'll be here. When we're talking about your triage, in a way this is not that much different from what the true healthcare providers and first responders dealing with. It's just got a different focus. You're starting to try to figure out, hey, what systems are involved, what data is at risk, what are the physical locations, what parts of the network are addressed, who are the individual owners of the systems if they're separate systems, do we have options to pivot away from that system to another? It's that initial gathering of information that helps you determine how to respond. We've got some different ways of identifying, how we contain it and things we need to consider when we're determining what's been lost. And we need to know what's been lost or what's been accessed so that we can cut off access if we need to, so we can identify the scope of any legal requirements or notifications, whether they're under HIPAA or otherwise, and determine who all has been affected. Is it our own system? Is it a third-party system? Is it an affiliate system? That's all pretty important. It's also important to make sure we know what happened before we start talking about it to the outside. Now, there's going to be times where the outside finds out first, unfortunately. But I think before any public notification is made, it helps to know exactly what's happening, exactly what you're dealing with. It's much harder to go and correct something when you've already made a statement that you later find out to be wrong. So I usually recommend holding off until we can give real information, which I don't think is that much different from, if we're talking about a normal treatment issue, right? I'd rather not say what I don't know. I'd rather say what I do know. And this is not a situation where immediately there are a whole lot of requirements that require that immediate notification when we still don't know what's happening yet. There's a big part of the triage that focuses in on, and your plan should focus in on what happens in the first 24 hours. Who do we need to notify just internally? We need to notify the Chief Information Security Officer, our leadership, our IT people, our security people, and the legal team. Who else needs to be notified? A lot of that's something that should be evaluated as part of your plan, and everybody should know the plan. We need to know who the stakeholders are, depending on the issue we're involved. We need to validate what's happening and work towards containment and determine who all needs to be involved on that, all the way from the systems owner and engineers to the CISO, to the affected people, to your legal and security folks. I mentioned before, when it comes to attorney-client privilege, there are some benefits of notifying your legal team early. They can jump in and help direct traffic and act as the quarterback for some of these efforts, and can kind of help direct where to go, both from a communication standpoint and from a who do we notify standpoint. There are requirements in contracts sometimes, such as your insurance requirements, that say, hey, look, if there's a problem, you need to tell us about it right away or you don't get coverage. The legal team's going to know that and know how to manage that notification. Who should be on your key contact list? Well, your corporate security officer, your incident handling team, corporate legal officer, your outside security or privacy counsel, insurance folks, CIO or CTO, etc. Depending on the issue, it may involve local law enforcement or the FBI. And I always think it's a good idea to have in your Rolodex and as part of your plan, computer forensics experts and law enforcement contacts, so that they're ready to go and you can talk to them if and when you need them. Mentioned this before about the risks of not going public prematurely. That's important. Making multiple notifications as facts change can actually hurt you. So you want to move swiftly. You want to gather the information as you have it, but we want to make sure we really know something before we're talking a lot about it. When it comes to eradication and containment, having the experts on hand is pretty critical. I've seen a lot of situations where people went in and said, hey, look, we need to cut off access and we need to shut this down. And in doing so, the way they did it, they destroyed all of the evidence of what the bad guys did. So having experts help you do that to make sure that we can capture what happened and track down who accessed what and when is pretty critical. And sometimes the best way to do it is to have experts come in and help us. So some final tips from a know before you go perspective. Having a process in place to be ready for it when it happens is important. Having your service providers, legal contacts, insurance brokers all listed as part of a plan is important. Making sure we practice our plan every year, walk through it just to make sure we understand how it works and who needs to be notified. There are experts and us who can help lead those kind of exercises and organize them so that you know how to implement them, and that way when the time comes you can put it in place. I leave you today with an action plan about how to put a response plan in place. Now, this in the good old days, I have on here when you get back to your office, and so since you're already there, one of your first questions might be investigating what your incident response plan looks like and reviewing it, if you have one. And if you don't have one, starting to look at putting one in place is important. In the next 30 days, build or update your incident response plan. Make sure you've got updated contacts. Look at the requirements that might apply to you from a notification perspective and what requirements apply to you from a security perspective. Within 90 days, if there's templates or documents you need to put together, that gives you a timeline to kind of work in putting that together. Identify roles and responsibilities for people on your plan. Identify and source any service providers you need. And at some point during the year, put together a tabletop exercise to take that plan you've done and walk through it. Make sure that everybody understands what their role is and how it works. This is some more detail on your action plan. If you haven't done a risk assessment, that's also something that we should identify. When you did your last one, when's your next one coming up? Did you have shortcomings and have you done anything about it? Making sure we plan to respond to those things identified as risks. Track your progress. Make sure you do a new inventory of everything you got from facilities, systems, data, et cetera, and then put a new risk assessment in place. The last item I have is some notes on oversight, which is more for those of you who might be sitting in a leadership position, serving on a board of directors. There's an organization called the National Association of Corporate Directors that puts out some cybersecurity guidance, and they talk about it in terms of 5 key oversight steps. I think these oversight steps apply to everybody. They focus on saying, historically cybersecurity is often punted to the IT department, but it's actually a company-wide risk issue. And making sure that that's a principle that's applied from the top down is pretty critical so that everybody knows they have a role. Understanding the legal risks presented to your operation and how they apply specifically to your operation is critical from every person in the organization. For the leadership and board members, making sure they have access to cybersecurity expertise, both in terms of technical expertise and legal expertise, and making sure that risk management on cyber risk is given regular and adequate time on the meeting agenda. From a leadership standpoint, set the expectation that there's going to be an enterprise-wide risk management framework. It's going to be adequately staffed and funded so that you can actually follow through on it. And any discussions of risk should include identification of what the risks are and how to deal with them, whether that's through avoidance, acceptance, mitigation, or transfer, as well as what the plans are to deal with each risk. This is kind of an ongoing process that you go through after each risk assessment. There's a list of action items for directors as well and leadership. Talks again about making sure that this is something that has to be from the top down and that everybody understands that we all have a role to play. Making sure we're putting time on meetings at every board meeting or every leadership meeting to address those risks, and making sure we're updating our plans, adequately insuring on risk, and constantly checking up on it. that, my friends, is the end of the presentation. Hope I've given you some information to think about. I know we covered a lot of ground, but I'm always available to answer questions. If you have questions after the fact, feel free to send them through the chat. You can also reach any member of our Holland and Hart team at one of our offices if you have any questions about cybersecurity, whether it relates to healthcare or generally. So thank you for joining our presentation today. Let me know if you have any other questions. This is one of the things I love to geek out on, and happy to chat about it anytime. Have a great day, everybody.